So, welcome to the first of four parallel sessions of this PGS 2020. Just for those who join us now, my name is Skóra. I'm a policy fellow at das Progressive Zentrum and a research associate at the Institut für Europäische Politik here in Berlin, and it's my great pleasure to chair this session. I think it's a very timely session, and I'm very happy to have wonderful speakers with me here today. Zeitenwende, the left's new approach to security. This is the topic we're going to talk about, and to talk about it in alphabetical order, we have Tiago Antunes, the Secretary of State for European Affairs from Portugal. We have Weronika Grzebalska, Assistant Professor in Sociology at the Polish Academy of Sciences. We have Klaver, the party leader of the GreenLeft. And we have Werz from the Center for American Progress, coming from DC. So a very good panel, a mixed panel, and I hope we will bring many perspectives to this conversation. And let me kick it off with setting the scene. And I would say for this session, we are meeting in a pretty good environment. So Sweden and Finland are joining NATO, proving it's not brain dead. There is a Zeitenwende in Germany, when Germany takes a complete shift in its foreign and security policy. Ukraine is heroically pushing off Russia from its territory. Vladimir Putin has also proven his real self, and in a way this war shows also the weakness of his authoritarian regime. And last but not least, America is back, with the Biden-Harris administration being again a strong player at the diplomatic global scene. So the starting point, the point of departure looks really good, but what we want to do in this session is look at the challenges of security and defense policy and how we can approach them from the progressive point of view, the progressive perspectives. We've seen in the last months that perhaps there were actually some differences of perspectives and differences of opinions. And how I would like to structure this panel is to first ask Weronika to give her opening statement, and then I would like the other speakers to react, and then we take it off from there. So Weronika, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here, and I can't wait to hear all the panelists and their ideas on how to connect the current Zeitenwende with social democratic progressive values. Now, I was tasked with a pretty difficult task of actually providing some intro to this discussion, and I will talk about this Zeitenwende as something that is already ongoing, and we see patterns of it all across Europe, but the patterns are divergent, and we certainly need to do more. And of course, I'll put it in the context of the ongoing Russian war of aggression in Ukraine, because we can't proceed otherwise. But before that, I wanted to take us on a little trip down the memory lane and kind of remind us what we are actually shifting from. What was this very unique European moment, European way of life that we currently see we urgently need to kind of shift around? Now, as I guess most of you remember, after the fall of the Soviet Union, after the end of the Cold War, Europe was really granted a very unique, historically unprecedented opportunity. As we already heard in the opening remarks, we were basically granted a very long period of geopolitical stability and security, with no major war threat looming ahead, no nuclear aggression looming ahead. And I think we really did use it to transform Europe radically. Many sociologists, academics who studied it actually talk about a silent revolution of demilitarization that happened in Europe after the Cold War. To put it very shortly, we transformed our states from garrison states that were hostile to one another throughout European history to civilian states that cooperate. We transformed our societies to post-militarist societies that don't think military might is a good tool of doing politics and don't really, we suspended conscription all across Europe. We reduced professionalized armed forces. We started thinking of security differently. Now, the problem is not everyone did, and not all of our neighbors were on the same page as we now see with Russian aggression in Ukraine. Now, this war, the war of aggression waged by Russia in Ukraine, I think still took many of us in Europe by surprise. And many high-level officials, state officials, EU officials, are actually admitting that they did not know, that they were surprised. Now, I'm happy that they do, because it really helps us understand that we kind of failed on this level of strategic thinking, that we really took things for granted. But now, I want to say that to some extent, not everyone was equally surprised. And when you look at the northeastern flank of the EU, countries such as Finland, Sweden, the Baltic states and Poland, well, they have undergone their Zeitenwende quite a while ago. Now, we're not different in that region. We're not different than the West in deeper sense, in terms of mentality, culture, political goals. But we have been on the same train heading towards post-history and, end of history, European peace. But we got off that train in 2014. And we started taking defense of the EU seriously. We amped up our defense systems. We started rehashing old defense doctrines, such as the total defense that is now implemented all across the Nordic states and the Baltic states. We started training our citizenry. We started thinking of how to help human security in times of conflicts. And we started alerting others about this. And now, finally, with this full-scale military invasion and all the crimes of the Russian Federation, we feel that our Western partners are finally on the same page with us. But how is this Zeitenwende, happening in Europe? So I would say the patterns are very divergent. Now, of course, we've seen incredible solidarity with Ukraine. We've seen, all European societies condemning Putin's crimes. At the same time, when we look at public opinion polls, and that's actually very heartening, and I want to mention this, we see that the majority of European citizens are on the same page with regards to the most important things. They are on the same page with regards to the need to end our energy dependency on Russia. They're on the same page with regards to the need to impose sanctions, economic and diplomatic, on Russia. And they're on the same page with regards to aiding Ukraine politically, economically, and militarily, although that's the more complicated topic in some countries. However, I feel like we're still not fully putting our money where our mouth is. When we actually look at how much aid was granted to Ukraine, we see that it's, apart from the US, which of course has been the biggest donor, it's actually the small and not so rich Eastern European countries that have been doing the most. When you look at aid in terms of, relative to GDP, it's Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, Latvia that have been, providing the most military and economic aid, as well as hosting Ukrainian refugees. And the biggest economies in Europe, that of France, Germany, are not doing enough. And that's also, I think, the goal of progressives here, to push their governments to do more, because the time is running out. Now, at the same time, well, the last comment will maybe be about the left, to kind of set the scene for our discussion on where is the left. Has the left also undergone some Zeitenwende? Obviously, it's been always tough for the left to have and for the progressives to have a strong voice in security. Certainly where I come from, which is Poland, I didn't mention, progressives have kind of not been the leading force on security, and it was a topic always kind of defined by the right, and that was a very big problem and continues to be. At the same time, today in Ukraine, I want us all to really realize that leftists of different factions, feminists, LGBT activists, social democrats, even anarchists, are fighting with the Russian aggression. And as they are fighting, they are also doing their best to, reconnect with their European colleagues and comrades, and to reconnect their struggle with the values that we hold dear. And unfortunately, when their calls sometimes fall on deaf ears in Europe, and especially among certain factions of the left. And I'm not going to talk about it very much, maybe we will if you want to, but I think you know the type of left I'm talking about. The type of peculiar left that uses colonial frameworks of spheres of influence and denies agency to Eastern Europeans and says that they're simply in some one or another sphere of influence and their own desire to democratically define their future doesn't matter. I'm also talking about the left that's so self-involved that it can only see the West, the bad West, the US, the Western crimes. And of course, this is really important, but it shouldn't stop us from seeing that there are other imperialist actors that are now, returning violence to Europe. And finally, I'm talking about the type of left that's, so busy writing letters for peace that it just forgets to mention who invaded whom, and that this peace can only be achieved if the aggressor withdraws. But luckily, and this is my last comment, that we also found out through this crisis that there is a lot of what Michael Walzer once called decent left in Europe. We have a lot of this decent left, all social democrats and the Greens who have stood firmly with Ukrainian colleagues and who actually understood that they need to support everyone fighting for our values of democratic self-determination, anti-imperialism, equality, freedom, enlightenment. And I think that this heart of decent left is beating in many places outside of Kiev today. It's certainly beating in Berlin with the Greens. It's beating in Finland with the social democratic government. And it's interestingly beating in Poland with the left that has been very vocal on and even left a number of international organizations such as DiEM25 in protest of their shameful stance on this aggression. So to finish off, I'm hopeful. I think that there's a lot of other decent leftists in here, and I think that these types of panels maybe can bring us together. Thank you.
Thank you, Weronika, so much. Thank you, Weronika. This was very insightful and really is a good introduction to our round. You touched upon many topics that are sometimes painful, controversial, but no pain, no gain. I would say we have to unpack certain issues here. And I would now like to invite our speakers to react to what you said. However, my suggestion is, how about we divide first, how is this Zeitenwende, and maybe we detach a little bit from German, how is this turning point that happened on the 24th of February, how is it perceived and what it has changed in your countries? And then in the next round, let's talk about what it has changed in progressive thinking about the security and defense policy. So, Tiago, how you have a socialist government, progressive government in Portugal. How the 24th of February was changed. You also have a big Ukrainian community actually in Portugal. So this is a double this was a double meaning Russian attack on Ukraine for your country. How Portugal reacted?
Well, hello, good morning. Thank you for having me. Thank you for this debate, which is very timely. Well, indeed, it was a turning point, a watershed moment, a Zeitenwende. So we're seeing everywhere, pretty much everywhere in Europe, that a lot has changed since the invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February, from many different perspectives. And you can see, obviously, this panel is on security and defense. And you have so many examples of Finland, well, obviously the Zeitenwende speech by Chancellor Scholz and all the seismic shift that it has brought about in terms of defense spending, etc. You have Finland and Sweden joining NATO. You have NATO, which was being accused of being brain dead, which is obviously now perceived as something indispensable. You had the referendum on Denmark on the opting in to the common defense and security policy. So a lot has changed, and also I would just going beyond just strictly defense because security is much more than that. And on energy, obviously, what has happened is that we have realized that we in Europe allowed ourselves to be highly dependent and vulnerable on a foreign autocracy, and this has hampered our ability to react to Russia. And so clearly we need also a Zeitenwende, a major shift. Well, it's not changing course so much, it's just accelerating our energy transition, so that we are not so vulnerable, and so security of supply and having access to energy is key in order to also ensure the safety and security of our peoples. And so in Portugal, very much, although we are very far away geographically, we do indeed have a big Ukrainian community. We already had one, which is very well integrated. And so we received a lot of refugees coming from Ukraine, over 50,000, which for a country our size was very significant. There's a great amount of solidarity. And I think it's also important that we keep this in our society, that there is no fatigue with all the consequences of the war. And there's a risk, obviously, what we're seeing with inflation, with energy prices spiking, and that the public opinion will change. And we have to, I believe, it's also our duty as progressive forces to keep explaining that it's not just Ukrainians. Obviously they are in the front line and they are suffering the direct impact of this, these atrocities in this war, but it's us, really. It's European values, it's our way of life, it's our Western liberal democracies that are under threat. So that's why we definitely need to stop Putin and need to ensure that Europe will prevail. And that means, obviously, doing much more in defense and security policy. That means doing a lot more in order to ensure our security of supply for energy, in securing our critical infrastructure. And that was very much obvious with what happened with the sabotage of Nord Stream. And so there's a lot that we need to, in which we need to step up. And at the European level, I think there is now an understanding that also this issue of, as you were saying, common security and defense policy, it's not just the conservatives' agenda. It's not their concern. It has to be our concern. And we need not just soft power, but hard power in order to have a deterrence policy backed by military strength. Obviously not with an offensive purpose, but with a defensive purpose. If we want to defend our democracy vis-à-vis other foreign forces and autocracies, we need to have this military strength that deters these threats, and we need to engage in the world, in other areas of the world, where obviously Russian narrative and other powers are very much present there. And so we also need, as a foreign policy going beyond security policy, we need to be there. We need to be present, engaging, and well, I've covered a lot. I've gone in many directions, I'm sorry. But there's clearly, there's a sense of urgency. And there's a lot that needs to be done in many directions. And I believe it is clear now that at the European level, we need to move fast. And as progressives, we need to be at the forefront of this debate. And we need to be able to shape this development of defense and security policy from a progressive point of view. And so, as I was saying, this is not just the conservatives' agenda, this is our agenda, or at least it is now, for sure. I think there's an understanding now that this has to be at the core of our platform. And what we need to focus on is to shape how this is progressing, both at the national level, but also at the European level, so that is in line with our values and what we believe in.
Thank you. I think one important takeaway from what you were one of many important takeaways from what you were talking about is to frame security beyond only military and defense lines. This is the war on Ukraine is a retaliation for Ukraine making a different decision and willing to align with the West. It's the same retaliation that was made on Georgia or on Moldova in the past. It's not the first hostile activity of Vladimir Putin to former Soviet countries, members of the Soviet Union, that wanted to choose independence and on their conditions. And this is definitely something we have to come back to, also building alliances and strengthening the EU's potential in security and defense policy. We have PESCO underway, Strategic Compass collaborating with NATO. European political community has been launched, but what sort of animal is this European political community? Let's talk about it later. But now I'd like to move to the Netherlands and ask you, Jesse, so how has this war impacted the thinking about security and defense in the Netherlands? It's also pretty far away from where the war is actually going, but surely the shockwaves go through the continent.
Yeah, absolutely, as everywhere in Europe, I think. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here. Let me start with a question. Is there the Zeitenwende? Is it real? Is there a real Zeitenwende? And I think, I'm not sure it's really there. I think it's there when we look at our short-term crisis management. So we are investing more in defense spending. Our language has changed. But on our long-term policies, our long-term planning, is there really Zeitenwende? Because it's not only now fighting Putin and helping the Ukrainians, it's making sure that the geopolitics are back. And how do we make sure that the European Union has a strong alliance with our allies, but also that we are strategic autonomous? And I think on this level, there's not happening enough. Where is the planning from our leaders at this moment, and the strategic insights when it comes to Africa? What are we doing right now to make sure that we have a better position on the African continent? Because it's not, when it comes to our security, it's not only the Ukraine. What's happening on the African continent, it's even maybe as dangerous for us as what's happening right now in the Ukraine. And now we understand that we were dependent on Russia for gas. And now we're looking to the Middle East again to help us out. And for the short term, I think that's the right thing to do. As a Green, I'm so happy that the governments in the Middle East are helping us out, because we need their energy. But it's not a long-term solution when it comes to making our continent safer. Mm-hmm. So what we need when we want to have a really Zeitenwende, we need a much broader approach. We not only have to invest in the defense industry. As a Green, as Greens, we made a mistake, to be honest. We thought that we were safe. There would be never a great-scale war on the European continent, and we were wrong. So now we say, okay, we have to step up. We have to do more on defense spending, but it cannot be enough. And this is what's worrying to me, that we only focus right now on the defense spending. But you know, when we look at the European Union, if we look at what all the countries individually do, there's a lot of defense spending. But we also have 180 different weapon systems. The US has only, I think, about 30 different weapon systems. So if we put a lot of money in our defense industry, but we end up with 300 different defense systems, is Europe really safer? I don't think so. So there's also a policy question behind more defense spending. Do we dare to make is there more coordination between our armies? And even, do we need a European defense policy that makes sure that we also get only 30 different weapon systems, so we can really work together? So I hope that next year, then when we assemble together, I can say fully, there was a Zeitenwende. But for now, I'm not really sure. And to me, it's also, sometimes it's just a buzzword to me. Everybody says, oh, Zeitenwende, Zeitenwende. No, we have to act on it to make sure that there will come a Zeitenwende, because we need it. We need to be safe.
Yeah, maybe Zeitenwende is just a start of a big journey. And maybe we do need a European army and more cooperation and security on the continent here. Thank you. And I will now would like to move to Washington, D.C. and ask Michael, using the great opportunity you're here, to talk from this maybe different perspective. So I don't even want to think what the world would look like today had Donald Trump won the elections, had we not have Joe Biden. I think we are very lucky, not only because Joe Biden is a Democrat, but also because his political experience has equipped him with the understanding of the situation. Now, he has been in politics for a few decades. He saw the Cold War. He understands what situation we are now in a sort of Cold War 2.0. And I would like to ask you, so how this Russian aggression on Ukraine has resonated in America, in the United States. Joe Biden has taken the role of a leader of, as Weronika mentioned, of leading this coalition of help and support for Ukraine. So how has it been going on in the States?
Yeah, thank you. This is an excellent point. And as you say, Joe Biden has been, excuse me, in the business for a while. In his first term in Congress, Leonid Brezhnev was just taking over the Central Committee and Elvis Presley was still singing. So this gentleman has a lot of experience. I would
none of us was yet in this world.
Some of us. Speak for yourself. That massive depth of experience of Joe Biden has a lot of advantages. My feeling is it has also some disadvantages because his political experience and his intellectual socialization took place during the Cold War, and this is a new time. So I think just as a footnote, it is not that Olaf Scholz sat down in his office with Wolfgang Schmidt and said, let's do a Zeitenwende. This is not a bureaucratic act. This is not a programmatic term. This is a descriptive term. I think Zeitenwende indicates the end of a process that started with the fall of the Berlin Wall in November of '89, that was accelerated by the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001 in the United States. And now, as a long historical process, relatively long historical process, culminates in the February 24 confrontation with really the question that was first posed with the fall of the Berlin Wall is being renegotiated in an earnest sense. And so I think if we agree that Zeitenwende is just describing something that is now accumulating, that really adds urgency, as you say, Weronika. And I would say one of the takeaways for the Western European countries and for the United States is listen a little more to the Eastern Europeans when it comes to these issues, because you have very eloquently described that the sensitivity, for obvious reasons, is higher, but so were the implementation of policies. Now, in the United States, we are in a privileged situation, if you will, because the war is very far away. Even if you talk to people that are constantly dealing with the war in the White House or the Pentagon, there is a lot of historical and geographical and emotional distance. It's obviously also because we don't have to commit ground troops. So there is a lot of solidarity with Ukraine. It is absolutely clear that the United States is in the fight because it needs to support Europe. There are also some people that legitimately say, since 1916, this is the fourth time we have to militarily engage in Europe to save democracy. It's kind of time the Europeans figure this out themselves. It's also true that on the conservative side, if you listen to Donald Trump's campaign speeches that he's giving in the Midwest, when he says, why do we spend billions of dollars in Ukraine? We should spend the money in the United States. He gets standing ovations. And the congressman has mentioned that yesterday when he's in his rural district in Pennsylvania, that these are real issues that we will have to confront in the medium term. Because from a European perspective, you should never forget our last three presidents, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden, All three of them were elected with the promise to end international military engagement of the United States. It's very important. And so you have the experience in US society, which is highly ambiguous, that we started a mission in Afghanistan, which was covered by international law and was an international mission with allies. Then we started an illegitimate mission in Iraq based on false intelligence and with no legal purpose. And that has gone on over 20 years. We have spent on average close to $200 million every single day on Iraq and Afghanistan over 20 years. That's close to the German federal budget every single year. And if you come to the United States and you drive on our roads, you will quickly notice where all of this money has gone. So people are sick and tired of what they perceive as like spreading US wealth all across the world with completely questionable outcomes in this case of Afghanistan and Iraq. So I think as long as this is driven by technocrats, elites, and policy people, we will be very steadfast on Ukraine. There is, by and large, support within the US population. But again, as Conor Lamb said yesterday, there is kind of a sunset clause built into that support. And as the congressman also said, which I think was a very important argument, the administration will have to be able to credibly argue this is not yet another subsidy program for the Europeans, but this is a partnership of equals, and the Europeans will be stepping up. And so symbolic politics, but also concrete military appropriations and other things are very, very important. And again, a real opportunity to make up our collective minds, because violent conflicts sharpen decisions, and they also are decision points in the sense that you have to make up your mind. And so violence is, in a way, a process of political clarification, and that needs to be taking place between Europe and the United States and many other actors in the world, and that's why I'm really grateful that we're having this discussion.
Well, yeah, definitely this war is a catalyst and sharpens positions, but also demands thinking for the future, in the future, also puts the question of strategic autonomy back on the table. And it's true, the Americans were asking Europe to step up. However, in the EU, it's of course more difficult task, having back then 28, now 27 countries that would have to agree and harmonize and come together in shaping a common defense and security policy. So it's not that easy yet. We have to overcome and we have to deliver. But before we think about it, I would like to get back to another point that Weronika made in her opening statement, and touch upon the cleavages that this war on Ukraine has revealed within the progressive left community. We've seen different interpretations of what is going on between especially Eastern European left or progressives. We had many open letters from also the left in Ukraine, colleagues from Lithuania, also our friend and colleague Filip Konopczyński wrote a text about the perspective of Eastern European progressives on the necessity to acknowledge that it's not Ukraine's fault to be attacked by Putin. Yet this maybe did not settle well or was not so clear for some colleagues from the West. Would you again explain a little bit this cleavage so that we are all on the same page, and the frustration that it brought in Eastern European countries?
Yes, thank you. I think I would like to start by saying that I think there's more of the decent left in the progressive camp than the more radical one. So let's remember that you know, decency prevails. And I noticed before I got here to this platform, I noticed that in our booklet, there is a great article by Paul Mason. I don't know where Paul Mason is.
He's here.
Oh, thank you so much. And so go and read that. There's a lot about that there too. So clearly we're talking about a faction of the Western left. The Western left that has, these are actually different factions, so I wouldn't want to put them into one box. There's certainly the faction that kind of still believes the Soviet Union somehow exists, or that Putin's Russia is somewhat a prolongation of that. It's an alternative to the bad Western capitalist system. And they kind of, just don't notice that Putin's country is an autocracy, and it's actually a very bad, cheap imitation of Western capitalism, rather than a great alternative. Then there's, of course, something I started with, the kind of left or the kind of progressives that grow out of very dogmatic pacifist movements. And, I think we are all pacifists in Europe. I mean, if you look at the transatlantic trends survey done by the GMF over the years, you see that Europeans don't accept war as a tool of politics. Europeans don't want war. And certainly those Europeans that are now sometimes singled out as the warmongers, so the Central Eastern Europeans or the Nordic Europeans, like Finland, those who actually were serious about defense and were looked at with a little bit of suspicion by their Western colleagues. Those are certainly not people that want war. I mean, we have had wars on our territories and we have seen the other end of it, and these are things that live in our families. It's not something we read about in books. I mean, my grandmother survived war and had to relocate from the territories of today's Ukraine that are now being shelled. So we all this is our memory. But at the same time, we have a different idea of what true pacifism is. And we believe we need to legitimately put our money where our mouth is. And we need to actually support all those that are fighting for peace, rather than just sign peace letters. So that's so there's a lot certainly to be said about that. But I still think that the majority of us are not engaging in what was dubbed, what was it? The leftist West-splaining. That was the term trending on Twitter. So kind of describing to Eastern Europeans and Ukrainians in particular the intricacies of this conflict that they ostensibly are unable to understand while they're actually engaged in it. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Of course.
Elaborates more.
Yes, so you wanted to react.
I absolutely agree. And I think when we talk about progressives, we talk about, when I look at politics, there are left-wing politicians, but not all the left-wing politicians are progressives. And I think progressives should take a firm stand against the left-wing politicians who are actually very conservative. And I think they have more connection with the populists than they have with us. And I think there is a divide. And to make sure that progressive politics are very firm and stable in this world, and we need the progressives to stand up, we have to make sure that everybody knows we are not that conservative lefties, because there's something going wrong over there. Nobody wants war, nobody, but we didn't start it. So if there's a war on our continent, we have to step up. And me as a progressive, I told you so, I have to say sorry to our Eastern European friends. We didn't took the threat of Russia serious enough. So we didn't do enough on defense spending. I also have to say it to the United States. They helped us out again. So let this be that our generation, you were talking about our generation. Let's make sure that we make up for the mistakes the people made before us. So Europe can take care of itself. And we don't want war, but if they want war with us, we have to win.
Yeah, that's a very good statement. Tiago, were there also any cleavages in Portugal on that matter within the progressive camp?
Well, on the left as a whole, yes, but as we're saying, forces that are clearly not progressive, that have raised questions, but that's a very minor fraction of the left, and overall there's a huge, broad public and political support for us stepping up and standing with Ukraine on all levels: humanitarian effort, financial support, and military support to Ukraine. I would like to go back to the issue of strategic autonomy. because, yeah, that is key, not only in terms of security and defense, it's a major concept now in European policy. And when it comes to security and defense, of course, we need to have the means to defend ourselves. And we cannot keep on outsourcing the security of our citizens, and particularly to the United States. So we clearly need to strengthen the security and defense dimension of the European Union. This is not as an alternative to NATO, not as a threat to NATO, but in a cooperative way, of course, of having a European pillar of NATO. And so this is something that I believe is now much clearer throughout Europe, maybe more in the East than in the West, but I believe it's now clear to all of us. But the concept of strategic autonomy also can be seen in another dimension, which is when we talk about increased spending and investment in defense. Obviously, as you were saying before, we need to I wouldn't go for over-the-top things or very taboo issues like having a single European army, or it's not that's a question. It's just very basic common sense things as coordinating defense procurement so that we have more or less the same military equipments and not a huge number of different defense systems. That then doesn't make sense when we have to pool our military strength together. We need to be using the same equipments. We also should do this based on European technology and on European defense industry, so that we are not, again, creating another dependency on foreign technology, so that we are not shipping millions and millions and millions of euros abroad to buy military equipment. So we also have to strengthen our industry base, our economic defense base in Europe. Also, I would argue, considering SMEs, not just the big champions. We need very high-tech, small companies to be also at the forefront of this defense industrial base in Europe that we need to create. Because only then will we be strategically autonomous. And so this, we need to consider all these factors. We need to strengthen our armies, but we need to strengthen our economies, our defense economies as well, so that, again, we are avoiding other dependencies. And as was true for energy, as I was saying a while ago, because until we are truly strategically autonomous in Europe, we will remain vulnerable and we'll keep on being dependent on other parts of the world, and that's what we need to avoid. That's what it was. Well, we started to realize that with the pandemic, when the supply channels were being disrupted, and all of a sudden we realized that we were not producing masks or ventilators or basic equipment in Europe, and we needed that. And now with security, we're also realizing that we need to step up and create our own European defense structure so that we are able to face these threats.
Yeah, but since you're already mentioning the pandemic, there are voices that actually praise the EU, how it reacted to the pandemic, that the answer was relatively quick, and that coming together in solutions not only to the health emergency, but also its economic consequences, like the SURE program, for example, for saving jobs, that actually worked. So it seems that we start to realize in the EU that further integration and unity and cooperation is actually the answer to overcoming crises that are too big to be tackled by single national states. So maybe this experience of the pandemic and how we pulled through as the EU could be a blueprint or a path towards tackling the security and defense issues again together. And as I said in the beginning, setting the scene, painting the background for this session, actually we're in a relatively good position of everybody pulling in and understanding the how severe and dire the situation is. But so the Zeitenwende is not only a change to foreign policy or security policy in Germany. It's also a change how we have to start thinking about our industries. It's a change in how we have to start thinking about the sources of energy and where we take our energy from. But Michael, I will come back to you. We are the two Germans in the panel, and I cannot ask questions to myself, so I will ask you a question about the SPD, because the Zeitenwende came from Olaf Scholz in his speech after the Russian aggression on Ukraine, and this is a historic speech. Let's start with it, and this is a historic change for in German politics and policy. But within the party, actually, there were people, still people who not necessarily are in favor of continuing this war, continuing support to Ukraine or sending Germany actually engaging in an ongoing military conflict. There are voices calling for peace, saying that the most decent or noble war is anyway worse than the worst peace. How do you think Olaf Scholz and the party is moderating and managing this internal conflict, and can you see this mood changing?
You might know a lot better than I. I'm a proud dual citizen, so and I've spent the last 20 years of my life in the United States, so my perspectives on the inner workings of the Social Democratic Party are limited. But I think that from a US perspective, the Chancellery, and especially Wolfgang Schmidt as a person, because he has such a stellar reputation in Washington, have a very, very strong standing. And I also know from friends in the White House that the coordination never has been closer, even under like previous German administrations. That's very important. I don't really want to, if you forgive me, wade into internal SPD dynamics that I don't know well enough. But let me make one point that I think is important. If we continue to argue that Ukraine must be supported, and if the war drags on, and if in parties like the Social Democratic Party, but also in broader population, more people will have banners, make my gas cheaper and stop the war, I think we need to figure out how to push the political argument. And I would sound a note of caution not to overly idealize what is happening in Ukraine, as brave as the Ukrainians are, and the loss of life on the Ukrainian side is not widely published, but it's dramatic. It's supposedly in the range of the 80 to 90,000 victims that you have on the Russian side. So this is really a really high toll. But I would caution in us idealizing this as a fight for democracy, because there is something like a foundational process going on within Ukraine, so to speak, nation building under the conditions of war, which are not great conditions to think about liberal democracy for the obvious reasons. And if the war ends, and I think personally the war can only end if there is a situation where Ukrainians can say we won and where it's clear that Russia lost. What that exactly means, I don't know in terms of territorial structures. But once the war ends, we have also to be conscious of the fact that we will have a battle-hardened and steeled Ukrainian government, probably with a president that will remain in high standing within his own country, given the brave way he has run the war and how he has personally engaged with the rest of the world. And the question that then immediately will follow, because quite frankly, we in the United States expect you guys to pay for the Marshall Plan, or however you want to call it, right? We're not gonna do that, probably. The question that immediately arises is, how do you condition any economic support that goes beyond humanitarian aid and the immediacy of need of rebuilding hospitals and schools? Because I think if there is a medium-term perspective and there's any risk that you end up with a country of over 40 million people that eventually goes into the direction of Poland or Hungary, God forbid, that will have devastating implications, not only for the United States, but even more so here in Europe. So I would say our argument needs to be a strong normative argument. It's about rule of law. It's about borders that have been established after the end of the Cold War, about the integrity and sovereignty of independent nations. But again, I would be careful, because we did that in the Bosnia War in the mid-90s as well, idealizing actors as the spearhead of fight for democracy and the liberal order, which they were not. So I think this is really important if you think beyond day zero, when we start transitioning, hopefully sooner than later, from open warfare into transition. Very important. Also important to keep within a party like the Social Democrats in Germany as many people on board as you possibly can. There might be some that are absolutely opposed, but I think the stronger and more normatively based the arguments are, the better the chances to build broad alliances that stick with Ukraine, even if it gets very difficult in January, February, March of next year in Germany and other European countries.
Yeah. Wolfgang Schmidt is joining us later today, so maybe there'll still be an occasion to ask him this question. I think we now have some time for questions from the audience, should there be any. Yes, please. Please introduce yourself and try to be concise with your question.
Yeah, well, first, my name is Francisco Quiroga, come from Mexico. I will just have two questions. First, Michael, and you mentioned about the need to step up. But the only step up initiative I hear is homogenizing defense systems. That, I don't think, is really the step up you're thinking about. I would like to know what specific initiatives would you consider stepping up so that they really move the needle, make a difference in this. And second, I also heard about the surprise about, say, supposedly friendly states not immediately joining forces. Here, I will not venture an explanation. I will just tell you about the successful management of the pandemic in Europe. For the first year, the world in general received the tests, the masks, and the vaccines from Russia and China, not from the European Union, not from the UN, not from COVAX. So this put many countries in a very difficult position in which they have to decide between the security, the health security of their people, or more abstract geopolitical values. So in this sense, there are countries like Mexico that have very clear diplomatic values. The first one is no invasion. Mexico has been invaded many times, and so for us it's very clear, and across the political, ideological spectrum, the first diplomatic value in Mexico is against invasions. The second one is for dispute resolution in multilateral bodies, and that's what we are doing. And of course we have condemned the invasion and violation of human rights, and we will continue to do so. But the second, we will also try to do it in the multilateral bodies, and that's why we want them to be effective. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing those very relevant points to our conversation. Let's bundle a few questions. Gentleman, I can see you, the gentleman there, and then gentleman here.
Helfried Karl, Innovation in Politics Institute in Vienna, former diplomat. First of all, I would like to state that Mexico was one of the few countries that actually protested against the invasion of the Hitler Nazi Germany to Austria. So this is a long-standing tradition. And this is actually the argument I want to make, because I think one of the main issues that we need to strengthen is the support for the UN Charter and the values for the UN Charter. And we have to be critical. I think that in the past, the United States and also some of its European partners have not always, obeyed the principles of non-aggression and all of these things. And I think we have to be critical with ourselves in order to strengthen our security. I'm not one of the old left, but I think we have to say this and put it forward for the future. That's one thing, and the other one I wanted to state is if we look at security policy, I think we also have to make sure that we all agree that this is a public good and not a private good. And we always talk about the oligarchs in Russia, but I think we should talk about the oligarchs in Ukraine, but we should also talk about the oligarchs in the West. And the fact that the Western security and the Ukrainian security depends upon a figure like Elon Musk, I think, is an immense security problem. The fact that space policy is now made by American and other billionaires, I think it's something which, you know, looks like it's from a James Bond movie, but a bad James Bond movie. And I think we need to address this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the gentleman here in the front. There's more.
Thank you. My name is Diego López Garrido. I come from Spain. I'm the Executive Vice President of Fundación Alternativas. And I'd like to know your opinion about yesterday's vote in United Nations on a resolution on the annexation by Putin, by Russia, of Donbass, 4 provinces in Ukraine. That's my question. What's your opinion about not only the vote for, but the vote abstention included China and India? Thank you.
Thank you. I think I see the 2 more questions. I think we have enough time to do 2 rounds. We have still 15 minutes around. So maybe we start with you, Michael, because you were addressed with the first question from the gentleman. And then we have the issues of being critical to yourself and credible. And also, of course, the question about yesterday's vote.
Yes, thank you very much. And this is the ambassador of Mexico to Berlin, so I just wanted to recognize you and thank you for being part of the conversation. I think you have a very strong point there. My feeling is that the European response to the pandemic had immediate impact on the response of African and other countries when it came to condemning the war. That's not necessarily a nice setup, but this is how international politics works. So I completely subscribe to your notion that the European Union, the European countries have utterly failed because they have sent a massive Europe first message, especially to Africa, and we're paying the price for that as Western community. I think that's a legitimate point. I have to submit that Emiliano Zapata invaded the United States, so Mexicans are not completely without fault here, but I understand your argument. I would still say, if you rightly insist in multilateral organizations or the UN Charter, that is completely fine. You will always have my complete support for these arguments. On February 25th, that was not really a question. On February 25th, the question was, is there any way to make sure that Russian soldiers will not end up at the Polish border, and that decision had to be made within 8 hours or 10 hours or 12 hours. So I think we have to separate the immediacy of the war and the need to act swiftly and quickly, and I can only repeat, I'm grateful that the Biden administration decided to go all in the first day and that they actually prepared beforehand and were ready to move, because Europe alone could not have done this. I mean, this is just, our Baltic partners would be in a completely different world these days, and who know whether they would still be able to cherish their sovereignty and independence. So I think there is a place for multilateral organizations. At the same time, give me 3 examples where the UN Security Council swiftly and successfully solved conflicts that were close to be fought out in military terms or already in open warfare. The problem is that as long as you have China and Russia in there, and I know the history of the United States with its veto power in the UN Security Council is a very complicated one. I have my own opinion on that. But it is absolutely clear that it is a completely dysfunctional institution, and there will be nothing coming out of it in any way, shape, or form. So I think There is good reason to talk about UN Security Council reform. Other countries and other regions, and that is true for India and Nigeria and others, need to be represented. There need to be stronger voices. The Europeans can't have 2 or 3 votes with veto power. This is still an institution that is kind of far behind the Zeitenwende because it was a direct result of the Second World War, and the veto powers are all the powers that had access to nuclear weapons and needed to be given that veto power because otherwise they could create their veto power in the nuclear battlefield. This is not 2022 anymore. That doesn't reflect 2022 anymore. But I think these discussions need to be parallel discussions. There's a political and military debate that we need to confront and face. And at the second level, there is a question of how the Ukraine war should translate into massive reform of multilateral engagement, multilateral institutions. Initiatives, I think, very briefly, I think the strengthening of the transatlantic relationship in itself is a quality. I think in Europe, the things that have been mentioned here, they go beyond defense procurement because they signify a shift in how Europe positions itself in the world. And I would also hope that in other parts of the world, including Mexico. I mean, in my ideal world, we would have a conversation maybe 5 years from now whether Mexico should not become a NATO member. If Mexico would subscribe to the values of the alliance and also see that an integrated North America should have a relationship with the European allies, especially given Mexico's very close relationship to Germany, that is more strongly codified and not only in terms of free trade agreements. But again, these are discussions that are going to be difficult and slightly uncomfortable for all of us.
Well, but that's the thing about important discussions. They shouldn't be too comfortable, right? If we are serious about solving problems. Yes, please.
When we talk about strategic autonomy, too many politicians think we have to keep everything in our own borders. So we just focus on the European continent, but that's wrong. And this is what went wrong in the approach of the COVID crisis. European governments were only looking at their own communities, not to the rest of the world. And I think we have to acknowledge that what's happening right now, when we talk about the Zeitenwende, this is a conflict between democracies and autocratic regimes. So we have to broaden our focus, and we have to focus on what's happening in Latin America. We have to focus on what's happening on the African continent. And I think this is just a problem what the European Union is not doing at the moment. When we look at the African continent, China and Russia and even the Emirates, they have key roles. They are playing key roles over there. And we forgot that they have a say in the United Nations. So I think it's not functioning. The United States, of the United Nations, there is a big problem in how the bodies there are functioning, but this is what we have. So we have to make sure that we make new alliances. And at this moment in time, the United States and the European Union, we are not making new alliances. We are not working together with all the countries. And I think that's a major problem. So to your question, how I look at what was happening at the vote, I think this is what's happening the last 20 years, and we totally screw up with what happened in Iraq, because that was the moment that even the United States and also some countries in the European Union, including my own country, we said to the international law, it's for everybody, but not for us.
Yeah.
So I think this is where it went wrong, and we have to acknowledge that to go further.
So this is the answer to your question, sorry, about the credibility. I'd like to take those two next questions. And then there was a gentleman here and a lady here, I think. Yes, exactly. Here.
Thomas Schneider, representing DFK, German Managers Association. The two gentlemen from Portugal and Netherlands indicated and raised the issue of a European army. Having worked quite a while in Brussels, in the Brussels bubble, I'm dealing with this issue for, let's say, 15 years and more. I would be interested to learn, against the background that creating a European army would mean giving up sovereignty by the national governments on their on the boots, on the airplanes, etc., and the navies. Do you think the amount of crisis, the severity is strong enough in order to make this the trigger that governments, including the German ones and the French, particularly with their nuclear potential, it's a quite tricky issue, would be willing, maybe in the next couple of months or years, to give up this sovereignty and putting it in a pool, maybe, and allowing the European Parliament, in parallel to the German Parliament, which is now until now in the position to grant the permit to bring the German soldiers out of country, that in the parallelity, the European Parliament would be in a position, as a parliamentarian entity, to do this decision.
Yes. So I think it's always the dilemma of the EU of giving up a sovereignty to empower the EU, and maybe it has to deliver more institutional and political answers, actually. And the last question was coming from the lady there.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Hi, I'm Umeima Laraki. I'm working at Democracy Report International. Actually, my question has been answered somehow, but I just still want to ask it in a different way. You have talked about strengthening the military in Europe, but also engaging in other, maybe it's easier, engaging in other regions in the world, in Latin America, in Africa, but also in Asia. How do you think that Europe and the West in general can restore the legitimacy to engage in those places, especially on what you've seen with the pandemic, the colonial past, the post-colonial continuities, but also the climate injustice that is happening and that Europe has to do a lot with it, and other places in the world are suffering from? And how can we restore this legitimacy? How can we still engage in a fair manner in those countries?
Excellent question. Thank you very much, Tiago. You're on.
Thank you. So on the European army, as I was mentioning a while ago, I mean, there's huge ground cover before we get there. So let's focus on workable solutions. There's lots that can be done. And this is obviously kind of a taboo issue. It's a very difficult issue because it deals with sovereignty at the heart of each country's deepest sense of nationality and ownership and power. So that's not really what we're discussing at the moment. I'm not saying we won't get there someday, but it's not on the table right now. But there's a lot we can do to strengthen our defense and security power before going into discussions on creating a single European army. And on engaging with the rest of the world, of course, we absolutely need to do that. Obviously, there are challenges and difficulties, but also I would look at it the other way around. We have big historic ties with several areas of the world. In some aspects, that makes it more difficult, but from another perspective, it also makes it easier. And it doesn't make sense that you have Russia or China getting in these countries with such a strong and relevant presence there, when there are countries that historically have had no connection with they have ties with Europe that we need to explore more for the common good of Europe and these regions in the world. So our diplomatic relations, we obviously have better conditions to improve and take these relations a step forward, and we haven't done as much as we should do. So we clearly need to work on this outreach and engaging with these areas, and we have good conditions to do so, even better than other countries which are stepping up and moving much faster. Just a final word on the UN. Obviously, when the aggressor is one of the permanent members of the Security Council, it makes it all more difficult for the UN to enforce the values of the United Nations Charter. But you have seen other bodies stepping up, the General Assembly, the Council of Human Rights, etc., with votes which obviously they have abstentions from relevant countries, but they have been adopted by an overwhelming majority, and I would focus on this. And also, I would like to highlight the role of the UN Secretary General, Portuguese, by the way, who has had a very his efforts in particularly in together with Turkey in mediating and the grain initiative, and which at a certain point seemed almost impossible, and this would have tremendous consequences in terms of famine and food security in the world. And it was clearly something that we need to praise, that it was possible to find a way, to find a solution to export these grains, and the UN played a major role in that.
Yeah. Yes, so 30 seconds.
30 seconds.
Yes.
It's not the game 30 seconds, right? It's just my comment. Okay.
Yes, please jump in.
When it comes to climate change, you know, I think we have to meet the goal of 2% defense spending, but we also have to meet the 0.7 goal of ODA spending. When it comes to climate, the finance of climate, in 2 weeks in Sharm el-Sheikh, COP27 will start. It will be a big debate if the US and the EU will help developing countries in this process of fighting climate change. And I know the answer already. It's going to be no. No, it's not. It's going to be more than that. No, we're going to help you, but it's never going to happen. So in 2 weeks, we have the possibility to step up and to make sure that we that the relationship we have with all those other countries will improve, but we have to do it. 30 seconds, 29 seconds, I think.
Perfect. But then, Weronika, you opened the session, and I would like to invite you to close the session with answering the final question. So what do we actually have to do to reclaim that credibility that was asked actually from the audience? And what do you think the progressive security and defense policy should be? In one word.
I'll start with the second because it's easier. Because obviously, for obvious reasons, the topic is Zeitenwende, war in Ukraine, defense. We talked about the military arm of security and resilience, and for good reasons. We really have been lagging behind on that for years. But you know, as progressives, I think we really understand very well that something we've been advocating for decades, which is the idea of social Europe, is actually part of resilience. And in fact, it's not just, you know, without socioeconomic resilience of our societies, without strong solidaristic institutions, without effective public administration, we are not resilient, as the pandemic showed, and you know, many other examples. But now the point is that we also see that we cannot defend ourselves without socioeconomic resilience, because inequality is causing our societies to, you know, believe in conspiracy theories, to protest. You know, I'm observing all those huge protests in Germany and Czech Republic of kind of like the pro-Putin protest. And I understand that it's all part of this story. So I think as progressives, we need to also talk about this socioeconomic resilience as the first line of defense, so that our societies are more resilient. And part of this resilience is democratic resilience. And thank you for mentioning that, because obviously today we see clearly that, you know, we need democratic Hungary, and we need Poland that has a ruling party that actually abides the rule of law. And without that, the trust in these countries is, of course, undermined. So democratic resilience is crucial. And I think, I mean, everyone in Poland understands that, apart from the ruling party. So I'm kind of hopeful. But I also wanted to finish with one last kind of word of caution, because I understand this idea that, you know, we shouldn't kind of glorify the Ukrainian resistance. I don't think we're doing that. But even for pragmatic reasons, we have to understand the major consequences of what would happen if Ukraine does not win this war, and if really Central Eastern Europe becomes the new front line. I mean, and if then, by then we realize that we weren't unified and Europe didn't step it up, and we see that, you know, aid wasn't really flowing, and that to some extent this region was alone, I think we're going to see more illiberalism and populism. So we need democratic Central Europe, but we also need more solidaristic EU and Western partners. And when you look at public opinion polls, we clearly see that all of Central Eastern Europe, the trust in NATO, the trust in the EU as a rose because of this war. I mean, right now in Poland, it's like the record high. 90%, 80-something% of people believe in both and think they're crucial. At the same time, trust in, for instance, Germany as a strategic partner rose only in one country, Hungary. And I'll end with that, just as a food for thought, that things are sometimes more complicated than they seem.
Thank you very much. Perfect closing. Thanks to my wonderful panel. Thank you for questions. Some housekeeping information. Now we have a coffee break, and then after the coffee break, we meet here on the main stage.